It is with distinct pleasure that I'm introducing our closing keynote speaker, Dr. Herb Colston, who is a professor of linguistics at the University of Alberta in Canada. And um, he really is a Renaissance man because he has written more books than I can count, and that's not an expression. I really mean that. So I'm just going to quote some of the most important ones or those that resonated the most with me. So, for example, there's a very important book with Ray Gibbs and called Interpreting Figurative Meaning from 2012, which I really, really recommend. And then in 2015, Using Figurative Language. And in 2022, How Language Makes Meaning, Embodiment and Conjoint Antonymy. And these are already massive works. Then with Ray Gibbs, he's published two major works, the Cambridge Handbook of Thought and Irony, and then Irony in Language and Thought, a cognitive science reader. These are massive works that every researcher in the field knows and has used. He's edited with Angeliki Athanasiadou two books on irony, a book on figurativity in general. He's the editor-in-chief of Metaphor and Symbol. So, I mean, this is already an incredibly impressive, but wait, there's more. He's also a creative writer and he's won an award in 2024, the London Independent Story Award. So I don't know what to say. This is just too good. We are very, very proud to have you as our closing keynote.
Thank you, Sal. I think I should leave right now on a high note. Thank you so much. Thank you also for inviting me. Thanks to you and Shelby and everyone else who was involved for organizing a wonderful conference. You guys have elevated the management of Zoom conferences to an utter art form. So thank you all very much for that. First thing I wanted to say is that I don't really consider myself a humor scholar per se. Most of my work has been on figurativity of various sorts, of various types of figurativity, etc. And naturally, given the connection between humor and figurativity, I rub elbows with the great works and the great people in the humor scholarship community. But I don't really honestly consider myself part of that community, given my focus is usually on figurativity. So I wish to apologize to all the humor scholars here because I won't actually broach the humor part of this talk until probably the second half of it. So if you'll bear with me first, I'd like to just first start talking about figurativity. So there's obviously lots of kinds of figurativity. We usually talk about both tropes and schemes. Most of my work has looked at tropes, but I've also dabbled with schemes. Here on the screen is a list of some of the figures that I've worked with. Verbal irony is probably the one I've done the most work on, although recently I've returned to looking at metaphor, and most recently I've begun a lot of work on idioms and proverbs again. In this work, we ask a lot of the usual kinds of research questions. The biggest one, probably from the get-go, was having to do with comprehension. Given that these forms and I say forms of language loosely, they're forms of communication because they can be written, they can be spoken, they can be gestural, they can be essentially any kind of communicative act. But the big question is, how are they understood? Especially in the linguistic form, you say one thing, but you mean another thing. And there's different ways that those things disconnect, and that's what the studies are mostly looking at. But the big question is, how does comprehension ensue from this? Early in my career, I sort of drifted away from the comprehension question and started asking the use question. Why do people use this kind of communication or this kind of language? What is accomplished by doing so? And what are the gains in that accomplishment? Because you run a risk a little bit when you're figurative, because you might be misunderstood, given that there is that disconnect again. And we can couch that usage question having to do with pragmatic effects. What are they and how are they driven? You can obviously ask the acquisition and development question. How do these things get started in young children? Connections with cognition. And certainly you can look at clinical or other kinds of divergent populations and see what goes on with them, both to understand figurativity in them, but also what they can reveal about figurativity in general. One of the things that's interesting about figurativity research is there are not a lot of omnibus accounts that attempt to handle figurativity writ large. Relevance theory is a notable exception, and it's designed actually to handle language, period. So it can handle figurativity and other kinds of language. A very elegant theory. I think big pieces of it are probably apt. I disagree with some portions of it. I don't think we need to put the weight on the inferencing process that relevance theory calls for as much as it says so. I think there's other ways to get some of that stuff. The standard pragmatic model, often offered as an opponent to different kinds of specific figurative explanations, which has not always stood the test of empirical work. In some cases, it has. And so my view is that comprehension can proceed according to the standard pragmatic model, but often it doesn't. It seems to take shortcuts. Most work in figurativity focuses on individual figures or figurative families. So one of the things that I've done recently in my career is I've tried to look at figurativity more broadly. I'm not really aiming for a omnibus account in doing this, but I was just curious about if we pull back and stop looking at individual figures and try to look at the whole mess, what do we happen to see? And the way I've done this is I've gone in and looked at individual figures and I try to derive a generic structure of the base form of that figure. And I look at things like how many domains are invoked by the figure, what are those domains, what do the figures do with those domains, and what is accomplished via those manipulations. And then see if there's a pattern that emerges across kinds of figurativity. So I've only have 3 of these examples here for the sake of brevity, but I've done this for a lot of different kinds of figures. So if you take metaphor, for instance, and this example was crafted smack dab in the middle of the pandemic, so you can see its aptness. If somebody says this year has been a root canal to refer to, let's say, 2022, standard kind of metaphor, it invokes 2 domains, a source domain and a target domain. And different metaphor accounts argue about this a bit, but in general, the way I describe it is the metaphor invites correspondences between those domains. Typically, it's lending some information from the source domain onto the target domain to give a better idea of the target domain. But there are other accounts that say that it's more of a blend of things and so forth. But I think the ultimate goal is to enhance the meaning of the target domain. Verbal irony is another major one. So if you're in the midst of a hurricane and you say, oh, nice weather we're having, that also invokes 2 domains. It invokes essentially what I consider expectations or desires or preferences or the normative situation, and it contrasts those against the actual situation that violates those expectations, preferences, norms. So you essentially refer to those expectations and norms as if they had actually ensued. And in so doing, you essentially negate that expectation to leave the nasty reality hanging there. And it's done as a roundabout way to complain about things. You're complaining about expectations having gone unfulfilled. Now, there are different twists and turns. It's versatile. It can do more than this, but this seems to be the base model of it. And then metonymy. So if somebody's referring to an automobile and they say, oh, nice wheels, that's also, in this case, invoking 1 or 2 domains, depending on how you want to frame it. The entirety of something and then a subcomponent or an attribute of that something. And typically you refer to the subcomponent or attribute as a means of referring to the whole thing. So it's an efficiency of reference sort of tool, and it also enhances meaning because you often will indicate something characteristic about that whole via the thing you pick out to refer to that whole. Now, I've done this for a lot of figures. The ones in red are the ones where I could show you diagrams right now that I have on hand, but we've done this sort of work for all the figures you see. And one of the big standout things is that most of these figures use 2 domains. Or if they don't use fully clearly 2 domains, they use something like 2 domains. So for instance, the metonymy example, it's 2-ish because it's subpart and entirety. Maybe that's 2, maybe that's 1. Hyperbole is actually working with a discrepancy between expectations and reality, very much like verbal irony, but it simply takes that discrepancy and makes it bigger, often to draw attention to it. So it's in a way working with two domains. And even rhetorical questions, which I often label as a one domain figure, they're using the interrogative construction form. So an exasperated parent at their child's messy room says, "Why do I bother asking you to clean your room?" So they're invoking the idea of your room is messy, but they frame it in terms of a question. So in a way, it's like it's using two domains. So in a nutshell, all this work looking at figurativity writ large, there's some standout patterns. Most figures invoke two domains. They do fairly straightforward things with these domains. They activate them. I think that's what rhetorical questions do. Here, contemplate this. They manipulate them in various ways. They combine them. And I use combine loosely in the metaphorical sense where you take material from one and you sort of add it to another or something like that. They divide or nullify them. And I think of verbal irony as the quintessential one of those, where one of the domains is sort of used to knock another domain out of the picture. So these things interestingly correspond to basic sensory motor human actions with simple physical objects. I think of this as figurativity in a sandbox. Little children moving little objects around and obstacles and showing relationships between them. And in doing so, they leverage all kinds of interesting meaning. More recently, I'm thinking about the high frequency of pairs of domains as being invoked in various kinds of contrasts. So I'll have more to say about that in a minute. So all this domain manipulation gives rise to nuanced meaning, and that nuanced meaning is typically pleasurable. We like seeing the insights that figurative meaning gives us. We see things differently. And so I argue that the core function of all of this is what I call social work. They are attempting to give good meaning to other people, and other people like that gift of good meaning. So Lieberman, who I quote a lot, he wrote this book called Social, and he talks about sociocognitive neuromechanisms that are designed to drive us to be social. We are neurologically compelled to be social. And I sort of dilute those mechanisms into three basic things that we always do. We attempt to make social connections. Once we have all these social connections, we have a complicated set of networks and hierarchies that we have to navigate amid, managing our social status. And in the midst of all of this, we are creating a social persona, the kind of person who we display that we are, that essentially conforms to all of our expectations about what people would be like. I cannot recommend his book more in terms of a good way to give a different understanding of figurativity. So again, I'm not after this big look at figurativity because I want to design an omnibus account. The real reason I wanted to design this new idea is something that I'm calling a fixation, actually two of them, in figurativity studies. And I want to be clear that I'm not saying that these things are wrong. I'm not saying that focus or attention on them is a waste of time or misleading. In fact, the absolute opposite. They have been incredibly important ideas that have hugely advanced our understanding of how figurativity in the mind works. And they have to do with mapping and sequentiality. So mapping you see in a lot of different kinds of figures, but it's most prominent in metaphor. And typically from cognitive linguistic studies, we very much focus on the mapping of a source domain material onto a target domain. And we talk about mapping and mapping and mapping as if that's the only way to think about that relationship. And it's a very useful metaphor, to make that clear. And we also, I mean, the entire domain of psycholinguistics is after the process of language comprehension. What goes on in what order, in what time sequence, what must precede and follow what other pieces. We want to understand that. And bravo for wanting to understand that. And I've laid out a bunch of things that we argue about that take place during language comprehension in some kind of order and where context shows up. We debate this endlessly. And at the bottom are some other things that also I could have put in this arrow figure. But I think that in focusing and elevating these two issues so much in our understanding of figurativity, we're not seeing other things that we could also see. So again, not that these are wrong, but they might be hiding our ability to see some other things. So I've come up with this account, and it's fairly new. It's only in terms of published works a year old. I've been thinking about it for 2 or 3 years. Some new things will be coming out on it in the near future. I call it frame contrasts within frame layerings. One of the worst possible names you could give to an account of figurativity. It's just too wordy. So I abbreviate it the frame layering account. And it's a rather simple idea, and it's not a completely original idea. I'll be clear about that. But I package it, I think, in a different kind of way. So it essentially says that when we, in an instance of figurative comprehension, it's as if we are peering essentially at once through a series of layered, semi-transparent frames, almost like windows. And each frame adds some little tiny addition or nuance or reflection or refraction. They alter the meaning a bit. But the key focus in this is that we simultaneously look at all of it. Now, I know that that makes it sound like an argument against sequentiality, and I'm not arguing against it. I'm just saying, let's pause that for a moment and say that if you consider all this stuff being there, how does that help us understand the outcome products? So frame one, I think, almost always has to be theory of mind. We don't explicitly talk about that when we talk about figurative comprehension, yet we're understanding the intentional communications of another person, and so that is one of the frames we look through. Social motivations, I think, are absolutely key. They have to be in almost every instance of figurative language comprehension. At the core of this is a pair of frames that vary according to the kind of figure being discussed, and I call them frame contrasts. And for instance, in metaphor, if I say my car is a lemon, I say that that invokes a sameness within difference contrast. So cars and lemons are on the surface different, yet when you put them in a metaphor, you're advocating some degree of sameness. So you have to find what is the sameness within the difference, etc. Frames 5 and 6, etc., can be all the other sort of things that could be in the interpretive mix. And by the time we get to frame 8, and I don't mean a specific number at all in this, I'm just saying there's a lot of frames we look through. It can be all of these things. The usual suspects, like the physical context in which the utterance got made, who's making it, person perception, what are the personalities and stereotypes and cultural backgrounds of all the people involved, personality characteristics of those people, what has gone on before, what's coming up later in the discourse, agendas people have hidden and not, things going on in parallel, what's not being said, what is not being said, what is being left out is often the very forefront thing on interpreter's mind. You're not saying this. You're not getting to the elephant in the room, and other sorts of things. So there's lots of things that can be in this framework. As a quick aside, what got me to this idea is some very strange inspiration. So Saul mentioned at the beginning that I do creative work aside from my scholarship work. Some of that's photography. Some of that recently has been poetry. And here is a photograph that I took in 1991 by accident. My first trip to Europe, I had a cheap plastic film camera that did not advance the film as I was taking photographs of my trip through Europe. And so you can see bits of Venice here, you can see bits of Munich, there would probably be bits of Salzburg in here, the different places I visited. And so when I had this film developed at the end, I was amazed. I said, this is my photograph of Europe. Again, a complete accident. But it gets the idea across here that I've sort of superimposed a number of different European scenes here, and they can all be seen and captured in one perceptual moment. Here's another one taken just in my house where I've got a couple of artworks hanging on the wall. There's light shining through my front door, creating that weird white pattern on the wall. And then there's a corridor receding into the background that was lit by the sun setting in the back of my house. So it turns it all red and orange. And you can see all these different layers of things that are actually coming from behind the camera, things that are in front of the camera, things that are on top of the main thing in the camera, things in the background, and all of which can be perceived in a kind of one time only perceptual moment. This is one I took on campus at the University of Alberta. Looking out a window, it looks as if this shorter smokestack is casting some kind of an image onto the taller smokestack, when in fact that's a reflection in the mirror that I took the photograph through of the ceiling behind me, superimposed on this. And I've even, this is another one I took looking at my back garden, where again, you can see layers of frames at the same time. And I've even put this into some poetry. So this is just a quick poem. This is a photograph of me being reflected in a little mirror that's hanging in a frame, which is itself hanging in a large frosted glass frame, setting in a window. So these sort of nested Matryoshka-like doll things going on here. And then as the caption, it's a photographer reflected in a mirror, mounted on a board, hung in a frame, resting upon a windowsill, shown by a photograph, embedded into a poem about a photographer, and then you can circle back to the beginning and it never ends. So it's a complete cycle. I won't show these slides here or these links here, but if you're interested, since the talk's being recorded, have a look at these because this idea of anamorphic reflection, sculpture, and perspective art is another way that I think you can sort of think about this idea of frame layering. So I'll just let you look at that on your own. So let me now take this idea, frame contrasts within frame layering. So I'm going to apply it to three different figures. Metaphor, verbal irony, or communicative irony, and metonymy. So metaphor, and instead of using the kind of standard experimental items for this sort of a explanation, this is just a true story that took place a couple years ago. So I am conversing, and the I in this is me. I am conversing with a fellow researcher planning to visit Edmonton. We're discussing a side trip to the Canadian Rockies, which is a common place we take visitors. They ask how long we should plan for the detour, and I say 2 nights, since it's around a half day's drive, so that would afford one interrupted visit day. They ask how we'll travel, and I say that I'll just rent a car. They ask why, and I say, well, there's a train, but it is slow, and my car is a lemon. I trust it for errands around town, but not on the open road. So I use a metaphor in this. If we put this in the frame layering account, I'm essentially at the core of the frame layering. There's this frame contrast where I'm putting sameness within difference contrast involving a lemon and a car. And that's embedded in this sequence of frames, always involving at least some social motivations, deriving what the social motivations are. And the outcome of this ends up being some kind of social work, the giving of nifty meaning to somebody, the enabling of insights to somebody, the showing off of one's cleverness at something. That's sort of a social advantage for the speaker in this case. And in this particular instance, it could be things like this. So I'm an L1 English user. My interlocutor in that case was not. They're a L2 English speaker of 3 languages, but they are a metaphor scholar, and so they're likely to know that metaphor. And so if I use this metaphor from English, they're probably going to recognize it, and that could lead to a little bit of ingratiation and a bit of social connection. There's also, I'm exhibiting a very informal conversational mood in doing this, which is probably showing that I'm very relaxed about talking about this. I'm probably very happy that this person's visiting. So also some social connection can be conveyed here. We are also both metaphor scholars. And so if I use a casual metaphor, that's probably going to trigger a little bit of meta awareness. We both realize, yeah, we're both metaphor scholars. How clever. Also some social connection. And then there's also probably some nuance concerning the cultural differences in transit. So my visitors from Europe, where there's lots of public transit around to visit places. And even though Canada does have good public transit inside its cities, it does not have great public transit between cities because it's a big place. So all of that would also probably be in the interpretive mix here. Now, if I apply this to verbal irony or communicative irony, and following on with this same sort of realistic example, after spending over an hour on the car rental store's website to secure my rental, my visitor and I are about to leave to collect the rental car. At that moment, I see a voicemail message from the rental store, and I just play it aloud. The speaker says they are all out of cars for that morning and accordingly have canceled my reservation. I say aloud to my visitor, verbatim, oh, just absolutely perfect. Now, again, fairly standard verbal irony. I'm saying something positive about something negative. I'm, pointing to the expectation that got violated here, etc. Or again, if you sort of give it a diagrammatic depiction here, I'm saying great about not getting a car. That's a frame contrast embedded in a frame layer. There's always social motivations going on, and it comes out as social work. And anything can be in this set of frames that is relevant to the interpretive situation. So again, for this particular one, the particulars of my construction. So I say just absolutely perfect. So I'm being very specific about how perfect it is in a way to be ironic about, okay, I have done all this work, I put in all this effort, where at the very moment of going to collect the car, when the car rental agency calls me up and says they don't have any cars. The car rental agency tells me after having reserved a car for me, they don't have a car for me. It's almost like twisting the knot of that irony as tightly as it can be twisted. Now I'm also in a hosting role in renting this car, and suddenly I've been tripped up in that. That makes me doubly frustrated because it's not just frustrating me, but it's frustrating my desire to be a good host with my visitor. And again, you have some possibilities with the L1 speaker, who is typically a sarcastic person, although he often uses it in a lighthearted way. And my interlocutor, who's not a typically sarcastic, very person, but is a figurativity scholar, who would probably suss that I am not being incredibly bitter about this. I'm just like, oh, great. Now I'm going to have to go rent another car. And then again, we're both metaphor figurativity scholars. That's going to trigger some common ground between us, and again, social connection and other possible things. And now metonymy. So after much additional work, I find another car rental store that guarantees they have a car on hand. We arrive at the rental store, and after clearing the paperwork at the counter, we're shown to the car park. To our delight, we see they've assigned us with a new, sleek Dodge Charger sports car. This is a very nice car, very different from my Lemon, fully loaded with all the latest accessories. My visitor turns to me and somewhat tongue-in-cheek says, "Nice wheels." So again, you can embed the metonymic contrast, which I refer to as a referential specificity contrast, referring to the car via its tires or its wheels, embedded within a long series of social frames, all the other pieces that are in the interpretive mix. And in this case, they could be, so in this case, my visitor is the speaker. They're not an L1 English user, but they adopt my casual figurative speaking style in this case as a means of sort of copying me, and that's a kind of social connection. They're hearkening back to this series of figurative utterances that we've been both using. That's also a social connection. Again, we're both figurativity scholars, so we're in on the joke. And of course, personality characteristics. So my interlocutor is a very witty person, and I can appreciate that wittiness by their use of figurativity in this case. Okay, now we've gotten to the humor part. And at this point, I should probably talk about the elephant in the room. If you've been paying attention to my design of this emerging frame contrast within frame layering account, it might look familiar. And the reason why it looks familiar is simply because Salvatore Attardo has an idea known as the general theory of verbal humor, which is extremely similar to this. And I wanted to just make this global point. When I was developing this account for figurativity, I did not have Sal's idea in mind. Honestly, I was aiming for, let's get around these fixations a little bit. Let's pull back and try to look at figurativity writ more largely. And if we concentrate on the ingredients in the mixture and then pay attention to the um, entree that comes out of that and worry less about the procedural parts of the recipe, what do we have? And this is what I arrived at. And then when I was given an opportunity to apply this account to riffing, I went back and refamiliarized myself with Saul's account and was shocked a bit to say, wow, we came up with extremely similar accounts, one for humor and one in my case for figurativity. And I think that tells us something interesting about figurativity and humor, which I'll return to at the end of the talk. So let's now talk about riffing. A very interesting and in my personal situation, a absolutely wonderful kind of humor. What is it? I probably explaining the obvious to this community here, but nonetheless, it's the best I can describe it is it's a sequence of humorous heckles or comments or asides, typically about a running background narrative. Usually something really, really bad, like a terrible B movie, a short film, something that's just of poor quality one way or another. Although it doesn't have to be, it can be something quite good. But it's usually the riffing, it comes easier if the thing you're riffing on is bad. Mystery Science Theater 3000 or MISCI is a classic example of this television show from the United States in the 90s that is ongoing. There's a bunch of spin-offs and similarities. So there's riff tracks, cinematic Titanic, the Mads are back. I believe I looked this up that there's a club or someplace in Austin that's called the Master Pancake Theater, where I think they actually do live riffing on stage. And there are live versions of this too. They're not all filmed and recorded. Beavis and Butthead, the silly cartoon from the 90s, had a riffing component in it where these two young adolescents would riff on visual material they were watching on television. Many other possible sources. It's a very prominent kind of comedy. Riffs can be highly varied. Essentially anything that can be funny, you can do riffing to achieve. And it's aided by that background narrative that's running on its own. Because then the comedy, essentially the riff only has to provide the script opposition. Something's unfolding and you just spew out one script opposition after another. That can be riffing in its minimalist way. It could be done slightly differently, but it can be done in a quite minimalist way. You could do riffing on something that's not a film or whatever, but you probably need something that's got some foci of attention changes. Like you could be walking through some environment and riff on the things around you. You could be looking at something that's physical and moving from foci to foci, but you almost need that change in attention in order to do the riffing, I think. So the Mystery Science Theater 3000 setup, very interesting show comedically because it's built around riffing, but it's got lots of other components in it that enable enriching of that riffing. So the basic setting and plot is there's this guy, he's a janitor at a think tank sort of place that's underground, and in this underground area there's some mad scientists. They send him up in orbit. He's on a spaceship. And what they do is they force him to watch bad movies on this spaceship to test his reactions to it. And to stay sane, he supposedly builds some robots on the spaceship with him. So Joel, the main character, and these two robots are the main riffers in the earlier part of the series. And there's other things that go on. There are these things called host segments where there'll be episodes of their life on the ship, many of which involve very creative and absurdist, playful scenes where they'll take some theme or something from the film that they riff on, and they'll have a little play session where they're just doing something crazy and playing with it. The initial series had an aspect of it being a local children's television show that used to exist in at least American television in the 50s and 60s. There are segments with the mad scientists, referred to as the mads, down in their laboratory. And in later seasons, they did a much more elaborate backdrop narrative that, in my opinion, made the quality of the show a little too complex, but nonetheless, that was there. So all this other componentry really enables an enrichment to the riffing because you get a good sense of the characters doing that riffing, their relationships, their likes and dislikes, and that spills through the riffing that they do and makes it more interesting. But this can be done. Other versions of riffing are extremely minimalist. You simply have the film unfolding and comments about it as it goes through. None of the backstory or character development or any of that. So this is what it sort of looks like. You're in a watching the watcher's position. It's as if you're in a movie theater sitting behind these riffers, Joel in the middle and the two robots beside him. The film takes place above them, so you get to watch the film and hear their riffing simultaneously. This is one of the host segments. This is where one of the things they did is they had an invention exchange where Joel and the bots had to show an invention to the Mads and vice versa. And this is Joel having done a brain-controlled electric guitar. This is the children's show segment where they actually had real letters sent into the show. They would put a post office box on the program and they would read those letters and have fun with that. These are the mad scientists demonstrating a tough love chair that they had developed. Um, Now, the narrative strategy of this, and I'll use commentary from the general theory of verbal humor to talk about this. In its minimalist form, virtually all of the knowledge resources are in the background narrative, and only the script oppositions, as I said earlier, are typically needed to do the riffs. But patterns can emerge in that as characteristics of the riffers' personalities and other things emerge. In the more elaborate MISCI format, as I said, the KR, the knowledge resources can get mixed. But the way the show is set up, when it shifts to riff mode, where they go into the theater and then they riff on the movie for a while, it's largely um, script opposition after script opposition. But when they move into the ship episodes, then the comedy can have all different kinds of formats to it. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to take the frame layering account and apply it to three pseudo figurative riffs. And I had always wanted to write something about riffing because I always felt riffs felt like figures when I was watching them. And this was my first attempt to do that. So season 5, episode 24, there was a metaphorical-esque riff that takes place. The bots and Mike, in this case, Mike was the host in later seasons. They're watching a short film showcasing the new General Motors cars of 1956. And it's a short film called Design for Dreaming. You can find this on the internet. In one quick scene, one of the new cars is spinning around on a turntable displaying the car, and the front end of the car swings around. And at that moment, seemingly out of nowhere, Crow starts making these aggressive growling sounds. And the experience in watching this is like, what is he doing? It makes no sense for a moment. And then when you get a good look at the car, it makes sense. So he's going, "Rrr, rrr," and you realize once you look at the car, that's what the car looks like. The car looks like a growling animal. But it takes a moment to realize that because the film is unfolding and there's lots going on. But once you realize it, it's extremely funny. So again, putting this in frame layering, it's metaphorical-esque. We have a sameness within difference contrast. The car and the dog or the growling animal are different things, but there's a sameness within them via their juxtaposition. That's embedded in a layer of frames. Again, there's always social motivations in this, but in this case, rather than there's also social work that comes out of it, but the bigger goal is simply humor, just be funny, which of course can then do social things, but the foci is a little bit more having to do with humor than leveraging nuanced meaning here. Here's this is a typo. This should say an irony-esque riff. I didn't change that. So this is season 5, episode 20. And this one I should say ahead of time is harder to capture the humor in the retelling of it. And it can sound kind of crass, but I'll do my best. But it's extremely funny in the actual watching of the episode. So now they're riffing on a short film that's advocating safe driving practices at railroad crossings. It's called Last Clear Chance, another film you can also get on the internet. Now, the film is a heavy-handed safety 1950s era film, and it's designed to just like work on your fears and emotions about things. It opens at a somber funeral procession of cars that are pulling into a cemetery. A police car pulls up behind all the other cars, and the policeman gets out of the car and starts doing a voiceover. And he's lamenting the scene. He looks on with this expression of just tragedy on his face, and he says, "I suppose I should have gone in for a few minutes, but I just couldn't. I could just say my goodbyes from here." And at that moment, Servo lightly and glibly shouts out, "Goodbye!" in this very flippant way, like you're happily leaving. "See you later. Goodbye." And it so contrasts with the somber notion of the film, but it does so in a way that's actually very funny. And the one I've noticed this as a theme in many of their riffs. Some of their base material is so bad. Your experience in watching it, because you're also watching the film along with the riffing, is how on earth could this have ever been made? This is so awful. And you can feel your aesthetic heart dying within you because it's so bad. And then they'll come out with these riffs that utterly take away that feeling, and you have this huge freeing sense of release from that anguish of how horrible some of the material is. And this one does a great job of doing that. Again, we have a frame contrast, in this case, an oppositional contrast, where a very, very glib, happy goodbye is contrasted with a very, very somber one. And that's embedded within a frame layering, again, where there's social motivations, but the large outcome is humor in this case. And then one more, a metonymy-esque kind of script. This is season 4, episode 10. This time it's Joel, the original host. And here they're riffing on a Hercules epic, Hercules against the Moon Men, a series of a bunch of Hercules films that came out in the 1960s. One particular riff concerns a character who is dressed in a period outfit with a vest that has a stitched sequence of 3 rectangular panels crossing his chest, each that has a circle in the middle of it. At a pause in the dialogue, Joel points to this man and simply says, "He's a chest of drawers." And it's very funny because, again, it takes a moment to resolve this, but then you realize, oh, okay, this guy, he looks like he's wearing what looks like a chest of drawers. And it's a clever comment because it's a mixture of metaphor and metonymy. It's taking a metaphorical structure, but it's using a metonymic reference within it. And it's quite funny. So again, in this case, we have a referential specificity, contrast, embedded in a series of frames. Again, always with a social motivation, with humor being the main output. So very quickly, how do figures and riffs align and differ in this account? The key, I've covered up my own writing here. So the key alignment, I can't actually see it, um, has to do with embedded. I can't read my first line. Embedded in a rich set of interpretive altering frames. Oh yeah, the key alignment is that you have script oppositions embedded in a series of interpretive altering frames. Figures and riffs can also behave similarly, that figures can be funny and riffs can utilize and can convey complex, nuanced meaning. So their main idea is different. Figures typically want to leverage nuanced meaning. Riffs typically want to leverage humor, but both can do both. So they overlap quite readily that way. The key difference, though, is their purpose. And I just said again, figures are for meaning, riffs are for humor. So now let's take a look at this frame contrast account and the general theory of verbal humor. How do they align and how might they differ a little bit? Um, the the one part is that they both emphasize that you have to have a lot of material in place, a lot of key things in order for humor or figurative meaning to arise. In the general theory of verbal humor, those are the knowledge resources. There's a handful of those. They nearly always have to be present, and they sort of frame out the humor. In the frame contrast within frame layering's account, I talk about frame layers. You just have to have all these little bits and pieces that can be a part of the interpretive mix. Um, they both emphasize a crucial core conflict that has to be there that enables the nuanced meaning leveraging or the humor leveraging. And they're the script oppositions in the general theory, they're the frame contrasts in the frame account. And they both result in a very pleasurable, meaningful, socially laden outcome, either nuanced meaning or humor or a mixture of the two. Typically, again, the general theory of verbal humors aiming for humor. The frame layering account is aiming to explain nuanced meaning, but both can do both. How might they differ? I think in one case they differ because of the nature of the script oppositions. In the general theory of verbal humor, those can be of all kinds. And I think I really like the optimal moderate level that those have been cast in that theory because they're not too specific, but not too general. They say a script opposition, and it doesn't have to be an opposite. It can just be a deviance from an expectation, a contrast of some sort. They nicely keep that sort of flexible. Um, in the frame layering account, though, the kinds of contrasts vary according to the kind of figurative language. So in metaphor, we have a sameness with indifference contrast. In verbal irony, we have an oppositional contrast. In metonymy, we have a referential specificity contrast. Hyperbole, we have a magnitude of discrepancy contrast. Idioms, proverbs, allegory, those things that operate a lot like metaphor, also use a sameness and difference contrast. And even in tautology, boys will be boys, girls will be boys. A toaster is a toaster. We have a definitional non-circularity contrast, where if you want to explain what something is, you typically have to refer to something else. That's the nature of a definition. It's circular if you don't do that. Tautology violates that on purpose. So it's a definitional non-circularity contrast. I think they also differ on the nature of the knowledge resources. So there's very specific categories of those in the general theory of verbal humor. And the frame layering account, I honestly haven't gone through and done the work to see what those categories might be, and I suspect they would be similar if I did that. But instead, I've simply said it's anything that's relevant to the interpretive mix. But I've had this emphasis on the social component to those frame learnings. So, what do I have to say in conclusion? Well, again, I think it's kind of remarkable that independently, a scholar who looks at humor and a scholar who looks at figurativity, trying to come up with this kind of a broader account, end up with very, very similar accounts, quite similar. I was very impressed by that. And I should say, as a quick aside, this is not the first time this has happened between Sal and I. Back in around 2000 or so, he and I each published a paper separately, about 6 months apart. We both had a very similar idea. I was working with verbal irony at the time. And ever since that moment, I said, Sal and I must be quantumly entangled somehow because we think similarly. And this is, I think, evidence of that happening again. But in terms of humor and figurativity, what can we say about that? Well, we have humor described by the general theory of verbal humor, figurativity described by the frame learning account. These are both broad phenomena in the human condition. They seem to have tendrils in animal functioning. Both of these things are similar. They've always felt related. One can lead to the other can lead to the one. Yet they also, in some way, feel different. So the laughter, the humorousness that we experience from instances of humor, and then the insightfulness, the understanding that, oh, I get that. Oh, that's interesting. The nuanced meaning we get from figurativity also have a difference to them. One is a tee-hee situation and one is a aha situation. But I'm arguing that given that these broad accounts looking at these two separate phenomena end up being very similar, maybe that's because the phenomena are essentially the same thing in some kind of way. It's a socio-cognitive, emotive phenomenon that is ultimately serving humans' social needs. So humor, my final thought on this is humor is meaningfulness play, whereas figurativity is meaningfulness craft. They're working with meaningfulness and they just slightly alter in what they do with those things. The humor part is playing with it. The figurativity part is crafting it to build some bit of meaning. Thank you.